started with our GO session. We are coming back to Bill 6-18, Contracts, Labor Peace Agreements, Displaced Service Workers Amendments. And this particular bill, sponsored by Council Members Elridge, Hucker, and co-sponsored by Council Members Rice, by myself. This was introduced on March 6th, and a public hearing was held on April 3rd. As I said earlier, we already had a work session on July 9th, where I think we worked through quite a number of issues and really truly narrowed it down to two discrete issues, which is why we're back to make those decisions. There were the committee expressed interest in having staff develop language that could clarify some of the areas that we felt were still outstanding. And so we are here, and we welcome Councilmember Hucker. I do see some artifacts that belong to Councilmember Elrich. I'm sure he'll be here soon. And also welcome welcome Director Branson, as well as folks from the administration who are here, and Ms. Vicki Leonard, who is here from LIUNA, who has worked very closely, I think, with everybody on this particular bill. I think also for the record, it's important to say that this bill is not necessarily unique, because it's already been, the council has already worked on a bill to address issues of displaced workers, mostly in commercial cleaning in areas. And so I think there is a tradition in the council working very closely with the administration to ensure that those who are working very, very hard to make ends meet, that we provide some sense of dignity, protection, so they can perform their jobs, feed their families, and have some sense of security as much as we can provide. So with that, let's see, Mr. Drummer, if you could not go through everything that we went through the first time, but just kind of, if we could zero in on the outstanding issues, the amended language. We did receive a memorandum from the County Executive Legate on September 13th that I think expressed some of his positions and his concerns. In addition to that, I believe, and it's in your packet, we also received communication from Ms. Leonard from LIUNA on comments regarding the language, et cetera. So if we could just kind of also take that into consideration as we talk. And Mr. Drummer, I know that you have drafted also language to respond to the two outstanding issues, so maybe we can, well, of course, we'll discuss that and make a decision. So with that, Mr. Drummer.
Good morning. As you mentioned, the bill has three parts. It has the labor peace agreement requirement, which the committee already narrowed down to just the trash hauling contracts. It has a mandatory price increase provision, which is a provision that you asked me to draft an amendment for, which I have done. It's in the packet. I'll go over that in a second. And of course, then there's the adding trash hauling contracts to the Displaced Service Workers Protection Act, which you also asked for an amendment, which is in the packet. On the mandatory price increase, the request was to add an amendment that would, let me see, where is it in the packet here? Well, the request was to draft an amendment that would require the county to approve an increase in the contract price to cover an increase due to an agreed upon wage increase for the contractor's employees after the first year of the contract. The provision that I drafted would require and let me see, where is it? Where did I put it? Oh, here it is. It's on page 9 of the memo. And it would require a price increase provision in an amount sufficient to compensate the contractor for an increase in wages for the employees performing work on a covered contract to the extent the increase in wages does not exceed the last general wage increase approved by the county for members of the Service, Labor, and Trades Bargaining Unit established in Section 33-105A1. I added the Service, Labor, and Trades Bargaining Unit because I think that's the most appropriate bargaining unit that's closest to these workers. And in fact, if they were county workers, that's where they would be, in that's currently represented by McGeo. And it's limited to the general wage adjustment, which is something we talked about last time. I'll point out a couple of things. One is, if that's what the committee wants to do, this is the language I would recommend. I'm, of course, not recommending doing this. As I said last time, I think the current, contract that allows for an increase in price due to any increase in costs would be sufficient. This, of course, wouldn't actually allow an increase in price, an increase in the contract price for anything other than an increase in wages. If fuel prices go up, tough luck. Right now, we have a provision that would allow, for whatever the increase is. And I know the executive representatives here would like to speak on that subject. I don't know if you want to hear from them now before we go to the third one.
I don't mind, but is this, what are you referring to? Something that we already discussed last session? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
because I think the committee was pretty clear, and we spent a lot of time discussing a lot of issues. So, so I just want to make sure that whatever we're going to discuss is new information, not to rehash what the committee has already decided on, because
I don't think we decided on this.
Yeah.
No, not on this language, but I just want to make sure that whatever we're discussing, because I know you said that you were not recommending this, but we
Right.
already discussed that. So, and I know we already spoke about things like fuel prices and things of that nature, which would, we can't predict. I mean, these are things that we already discussed. So I just, as chair, want to make sure that whatever we're discussing is just new information versus rehashing everything that we talked about. So I would just please ask that that's how we proceed. So with that, Ms. Branson, if you have something new that you would like to add.
No, as we said before, the county, our current contracting language allows price adjustments to vendors based on costs that they can prove and demonstrate.
Right.
Those include unforeseeable costs like fuel increases and wage increases. So because our current language already allows for price increases, and in the several years, like ever actually, no request for a price increase has ever been turned down. So I guess, the county executive really cannot support a mandatory price increase on multi-year contracts.
Okay,
And I guess it's not clear to me whether this mandatory wage increase, or this mandatory increase based on wages, coexists with or supersedes, and therefore replaces the language that allows us to provide price increases for unforeseeable circumstances. So are we talking about potentially double, or are we talking about eliminating one? But regardless, the county executive is not willing to support a mandatory price increase.
Thank you. Any comments from my colleagues on this particular issue? Councilor Reamer, President Reamer.
Okay, well, again, we're starting here with the issue of the draft that the committee discussed last time had a mandatory CPI adjustment for the whole contract. We discussed that. I don't think the committee had a position on that.
Well, we discussed the fact that we wanted to pursue that and ask the staff to go back and develop language.
We asked the staff to develop
so that we can
language.
come back and then react to the
So,
language and make a
thank you.
decision.
So
Yeah.
staff has come back with a recommendation
Correct.
that well, A, that you not do it, but B, if you were going to do it, that you would limit it to the general wage adjustment. So that is not the step. Is that, just to state the obvious here, is that accurate, Bob?
Right, that's just the general wage adjustment that goes to all employees, this year was 2%. This, just in response, just to clarify, the provision that currently is in force is not in law, it's in the contract. And the contract provides for a price increase for, if you can demonstrate a price increase. That doesn't get superseded or removed out of the contract because of this provision. This is a mandatory increase due to a wage. If the executive wants to put in the contract a provision that would allow you to get a price increase for other reasons other than wages, in addition to wages, that could be done in the contract. We're talking here about what's required in the contract by law. So, it doesn't supersede. There could still be a provision that would accommodate increases in fuel prices. It would be in the contract, not in law. You're looking at me like you didn't understand what I'm saying.
I'm
So
just trying to
let me try
process
again.
everything. Are you sort of saying, okay, are you restating what you said before?
Well, yeah, just what I said before, and I'm a little bit backtracking because I thought I was a little misleading before. This provision is a mandatory increase when the contractor can show evidence that my cost went up because I gave my employees a wage increase.
Right, this is in current law. This is the
No,
current.
well, no, this is not current law. This is what would be proposed in this provision on page 9 and 10. The current law doesn't have any provisions requiring an increase in a multi-year contract at all. The provision that Ms. Branson is talking about and that I've discussed in the packet is what we put in these multi-year contracts by contract. It's that if you show us an increase in your costs after the first year and demonstrate it, we'll increase the price, your price accordingly. And that's for an increase due to wages, due to fuel, due to insurance, whatever it might be.
For some reason, we don't know why, the contractors are not requesting any increase related to compensation.
Well, the contractors do request increases due to costs, and I think in the packet, there's a listing of what people have asked for and what they've gotten. Now, I gather the argument is it doesn't necessarily filter down to the employees, but the contractors have been asking for it, and I don't know the answer, whether that gets to the employees or not. Let me see. Yeah, if you, on page 18 in the circle 18 in the packet is 18 and 19 shows the different contractors, the requests they made in recent years, and, well, with a percentage of contract increase that they received due to showing increased costs. This provision would require a increase in costs when they can demonstrate an increase in costs due to a wage increase, up to the general wage increase that the service, labor, and trades workers get.
Would the assumption be that they would come in annually to request that increase based on what that previous year's GWA was, or would it be that they would project their entire contract and say, we anticipate, our contract is building in a regular anticipated increase?
No, I think they'd have to come in annually and show that the wage increase has increased their overall costs by this much. And, and to the extent the wage increase is equal to or less than the general wage adjustment provided to county employees in the last contract, then the executive or, procurement would then provide an increase in the price to cover that increase. That's what this provision would do. And I think they'd have to come in annually and ask for it.
So you raise a legal issue with this provision a little bit later in the packet around the market participant to the extent that you mandate outcomes of bargaining.
Yeah, and it's a fuzzy area of the law. You know, we are preempted from regulating labor relations, collective bargaining between private sector employees and their employer. That's totally preempted. There's a limited exception that when you deal as a market, when a government operates as a market participant instead of a regulator, it's an exception to the preemption. You know, or if you're doing it to protect your contract, to make sure that the work gets done. The labor peace agreement prohibiting strikes is a provision that, you know, there's a fairly good argument that you're just trying to protect your contract, to make sure that the trash hauling contracts don't get interrupted by labor strikes or lockouts. When you start doing things like requiring employers to, now this doesn't do that, but I said if you start to require employers to provide an increase to their employees every year.
What doesn't do that?
No, this provision doesn't do that. But I'm saying these are the two extremes. If you put in your contract, well, if you're going to work for us, you have to give your employees, you know, whatever wage increase that we give our employees every year. It's kind of hard to tie that to protecting your contract, and it becomes potentially preempted. This is less than that. This simply requires. No, but I mean, something, well, no. I'm talking about something that's not, that you didn't ask for. I'm just talking about the extremes. This is a little less. This is, you've created, you know, you require, or you've permitted the contractor to come in, and whatever he's bargained with his employees, he can bargain whatever he wants. You've permitted him to get a price increase based on what he bargained up to a certain level. I don't think that goes too far. I think it's probably okay, but it's it's getting there. But I think it's.
Allowing for an increase based on.
Yeah, I think allowing for an increase is okay. If you tried to mandate what the employer does, I think we would be preempted. But I don't think this does that. I think it leaves the employer free to do what they want, and it sort of gives them an incentive to go ahead and provide a wage increase because they're going to get it back in the contract price.
Which is what they kept saying was the issue.
Right. I mean, I think it does that, and I can't tell you that that's going to get preempted. I mean, I think that's probably okay.
But that's our current approach, right?
No, that's the approach no. Our current approach is just if you have an increase in cost for whatever reason, come to us, and if we agree, we'll increase the price. That's got nothing to do really with, I mean, while wage increases could be one of the reasons, it's not really regulating collective bargaining at all. This is getting closer to regulating collective bargaining, but I don't think it does that. I don't think it goes too far. What I was just pointing out is there is an issue. I don't want to, in full disclosure, I don't want you to think that there's no possibility somebody could challenge this. I don't think they'd win. I think we're okay.
On the language that you
The language that I drafted,
as
yes.
the staff, as the GWA focus.
Yes, which just permits them to, whatever they bargain, they come in, they ask for an increase in price due to what they bargained, and they're eligible for an increase in price up to whatever the GWA was for county employees. I think they're still free to bargain whatever they want. They could still provide no increase. They could provide twice the increase that the GWA for the county employees. They're just not going to get it back from us. They could do what they want. So I don't think we're regulating labor relations too far. So I think we're okay. There is an issue out there.
Those were the discussions we had in the last session, which is why we said go ahead and proceed with developing some language. Are you finished?
So I just want more question
Okay.
about the living wage requirement. So how much does that increase from year to year?
That goes up by the CPI, so if they're being paid at the minimum wage, and I don't know if they are or aren't, I think it's the living wage. Excuse me.
You
I
know
think
the
the living
regular
wage is
share?
$14.75.
It's $14.75 now.
What share of the bargaining unit members or the employees of these contractors are at the living wage amount?
Everyone, if you have a service contract in the county, one of the things that we require is that you pay those employees.
I mean, I know that's the floor, but what share of the employees are at that floor? I've understood in the past
I
that a
don't
lot
know.
of them are at that level.
I don't know. I don't know what the, we don't audit for that purpose. We audit to make sure that, that folks are receiving the living wage.
You receive the payroll of every contractor, because you have to verify that all those employees
Right,
are.
we don't look, we receive like payrolls of like 5,000 to 6,000 people every few weeks. So we don't look to make sure that, the employees from
I guess,
each and every, if you hit the number, then we're good. We don't look to see how many folks are over the number, because we're just trying to enforce the
Here's
living
what
wage.
I'm trying to get at.
Uh-huh.
Let's say you have a contractor of whose employees 80% are at the living wage. They are mandated to provide that, and it's mandatory that that's going to increase to the extent that the CPI increases. So in a multi-year contract, they've already built in a CPI increase for their employees every year.
Correct.
And now, with this provision, they are potentially allowed to come in and claim a contract increase to pay the wage increase that they were effectively mandated to pay by law already for that share of the workforce.
Correct.
So what share of the workforce is that? Are we talking about 10 or 20% of their workers, or are we talking about 80 or 90% of their workers? Find out? Is there a way to find out?
I imagine we may be able to find out. It's not going to be
But it's just been my understanding
instantaneous
that these
thing.
companies substantially employ people at the living wage level.
Yes.
They burn through their employees. It's a hard job. That the drivers, and there's a driver, and there's like one or two people on a crew that are more substantially paid. The helper is the name? The helper's That's the person. Yeah, and then everyone else is sort of at that entry level or that mandated level wage. And then they deduct a bunch of expenses. They make them pay for their gloves and things that I think are ridiculous.
They don't.
Well, they used to. Maybe you've stopped that.
I've been informed that we only have to look at the collection companies. And if we could just isolate it to one quarter, then we could probably get it done within 2 weeks, so that, so I would be able to give you an answer, but no, I can't answer that question
It'd be helpful to
today.
know, again, because we're really trying to focus on a specific group of workers and how to help them ensure that they are compensated fairly. If most of them are getting mandatory increases that are already at the amount that this would seek to provide them, then we're not, we need to understand that, because that's not an efficient way to, all that is doing essentially is allowing the contract, the vendor, to pocket all that money.
Well, I'm happy to get back to you. If you give me 2 weeks, I can give you the answer to your question. I can't give you the answer today. We genuinely just don't review for those things. Once we see the number is
Maybe LiUNA could help
hit.
us. They probably know what share of their represented members are at the living wage, the county living wage number. We could maybe get some assistance there. And that's another question, is do we need to raise the living wage for these contractors? I mean, that's another approach to help this group, is to say this work is so difficult that we need a living wage. I don't know if this would be legal, maybe this gets into NLR area, but that the living wage is not sufficient. That's another question I would have.
Yeah, at this point, the living wage applies to anyone who has a service contract, and so, I assume that you all could change the law to allow to allow a different category, but that's a question for Bob.
Okay, I think I saw Councilmember Elridge's hand up. Did you have?
Yeah, I
first?
did.
Okay, let me go with the committee members first, and then we'll go to Councilmember Elridge. Can you turn on your microphone?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Part of the problem with the existing law, I'm asking a question, I shouldn't say it in the form of an answer here, but from what I see is part of the problem with the existing law is that you have to ask after the fact. Is that correct? You have to say, fuel went up and and therefore we need 50 cents more a gallon or whatever that would be after the fact. You don't say it before.
Right. I don't know if that's a problem, but that is the current state of play, that we ask vendors to substantiate their cost increase. We do not help them presuppose their cost increases.
All right, so if a vendor is, hires, I don't know, let's say 100 people, let's keep the numbers fairly easy here so the math can be fairly easy. But if a vendor has 100 people and 50 trucks on the road, and the fuel goes up, so after the fact they come in and say, look, we need X number of thousands of dollars to pay for this fuel. Well, maybe they could afford that because that's probably not the largest expense that they have. But employment would be in many cases. And therefore, if they have to do it after the fact, they might not be able to afford to pay somebody while they're waiting. So how do we, to me, what we're attempting to do here is saying, look, rather than pay you after the fact for wages, and there has to be, as far as I'm concerned, a way that there's a nexus between saying if we're giving you, X number of dollars more for wages, we got to make certain that X number goes to the person it's supposed to be going to, So, but how can we have a provision that says you can be paid before the fact as long as you justify what you're paying? I mean, if you're saying, that rather than pay everybody $14.75, I want to pay everybody $50,000, a year, so whatever those numbers work out, that we can't afford it. But how do we do that? And I think that's what this provision was supposed to be trying to do.
Well, first of all, the contractor, when he bids on the contract, the first year, he knows what his labor costs are going to be, and he puts it in there. At the end, near the end of the first year, he comes in and asks for an increase due to his costs going up. He knows what his labor costs are going to be for the second year. I'm not so sure it's really afterwards.
Is that correct?
We yes, that's correct. We assume that they are the best, the subject matter experts on what their labor costs will be.
So what you're saying is the way it works right now, close here, is what we're suggesting in this. We're saying that there's a mandatory, and I understand why the county executive is concerned about that. But what we're doing is saying right now, if you're at the living wage, it is a mandatory that it goes up whatever the next living wage is going to be, and the county needs to pay for that. As far as I'm concerned, the reason you have contract employees is because it actually saves the county in many ways the expense. You don't have to buy the trucks. You don't have to, all of the things that rather than have a person as a county employee. But it's really doing the county's business. I mean, that's what a trash hauler is doing. If we didn't have these trash haulers or whoever, we're saying it for this provision, but if we didn't have them, then the county would have to go out and buy the trucks and do everything that's so necessary in order for to get that service taken care of. And to me, if they're doing the county's work, which they are, they're doing it directly for the county, directly for the resident, then we should have something very similar to what we would be doing for that county employee. And that's where I am on this. I understand that it's a concern, but in many ways that is almost what we're doing right now. It's just that we have to clarify. My greatest concern is the way that I read this is that someone can get the additional funds and not give it to the employee. And that's not right, and it shouldn't be right. So anyhow, that's where I am on this.
Right, and I just, just following up on that, that's why we're here. I mean, the whole history with this has been the notion of, the strike and possible lockout, and we all know, at least for local government, trash pickup is the most important.
You have 3 days to know it.
Yeah, well, and so, again, I think that what we're trying to do is ensure that these are people who can count on having decent wages and making sure that, they are compensated appropriately. But because of that particular strike, we learned that these contractors, kept saying, hey, we operate on very thin margins. And so if this is something, I'd like to do, the problem is that we don't have the money. So just revisiting the conversation we've had on and on for a while. Councilmember, I think Eldridge and then Hooker. Councilmember Eldridge.
I was just looking into some of the data on increases, and the living wage in 2017 was $14.55. This is going up to $14.75. It's about a 1.4 increase, 1.4% increase, but 20 cents. And if it turns out if our COLA, and I don't remember what our COLA was here, but say it was 2%, then the $14.55 would have gone up 29 cents instead of, so we're talking about cents here. No one's talking about adding dollars per hour to anybody's pay. We're talking about adding cents, and what the county would have to go over and above the living wage would be the delta, the way I would interpret this, the delta between a COLA based on the general wage adjustment versus the living wage adjustment. So they've got to meet the living wage adjustment anyway. And if the COLA happens to be higher, then that's the part they should be asking for extra to be compensated for, because that's the thing that's negotiated. So we're talking about small amounts of money here, not large amounts of money here. The other thing is that as far as competitiveness goes, worried about people bidding on these contracts, knowing A, that you have to do the living wage, and B, that you're going to get compensated for anything above the living wage. What's the disincentive to bid on a county contract? The argument that's made in the next session that viewing this would be a disincentive for some people to bid. If I know I'm getting compensated because the county's recognizing, as Sid very well said, that this is an expected cost, we'd be paying it surely. In fact, I pretty much guarantee we wouldn't be paying $14.55 or $14.75 if these were county employees. You're getting compensated. There's no issue here. I think we've accepted responsibility for a certain level of wages. We haven't made these wages exorbitantly expensive. We're not driving the cost up in any kind of dramatic way. It seems a very tempered move. And if things get a little bit above the living wage, and I got to say that this living wage, when you look at the living wage calculator that people do for Montgomery County, the living wage calculator says the living wage in Montgomery County for a single adult is somewhere north of $16. So even these wages are more than $1 below what a living wage calculator says you should be making in Montgomery County. So it may be worth relooking at how we calculated our living wage, but I feel pretty comfortable with this, and I'm comfortable with your revision to tie it to the general wage adjustment. That seems to make sense.
Councilmember Hooker, thank you.
I agree with all that. The living wage, when we set it, was at 130% of the federal poverty level, so folks would not need or qualify for.
You need to speak up.
Whoop, sorry. So workers were not qualified for food stamps at the time. I agree with everything Mark said. Bob, I like the amendment. I think you threaded the needle well between avoiding preemption and guaranteeing the contractor that they'd get reimbursed for their additional costs. And I think Mark's right. Another way to think of it is, this is not just sort of a pro-worker amendment, it's really a pro-contractor amendment, because it assures them that the additional costs of a wage increase will be compensated they'll be reimbursed by the county, and they'll presumably accrue, have a more loyal workforce and lower turnover, and less recruitment costs and all the other things that come with paying people better. So, I like the amendment as it is. I do want to make sure we come back to Sydney's point that we got here because in the past we've passed on wage increases to contractors the wage increases haven't filtered down to the workers. And I haven't even talked to LaUna about this, but it just feels to me like there's nothing in the amendment as drafted that addresses that enforcement per se. And I'm wondering if we need language that says the director of procurement will audit to make sure the wage increase is passed on or something like that.
That was a conundrum with the former displaced workers bill as well. It's one of the big concerns.
So I didn't mean to get us off
come up
topic, but I didn't
before.
want to lose that because,
Yeah.
as usual, Sydney is visionary.
Could you say that again?
I didn't hear that.
Nobody here.
I think it would be hard, well, the contractor has to, under the provision that I drafted, the contractor has to prove that his costs went up because he's paying his employees more. He's contracted to pay his employees more. Under this provision, I understand under the current provision it would be different, but under this provision, I don't see how the money wouldn't get to the employees. I mean, because he'd have to prove that the money, I mean, then
retroactive.
the union would then be saying, I mean, he'd be paying his employees less than the collective bargaining.
Sure,
agreement.
but I want to put the responsibility on the county as well as the union. The union, may not be here in 20 years. I hope they are. They don't necessarily represent all, and it's our responsibility too. But I hear what you're saying, that this is essentially a reimbursement, and the way they prove is by submitting the certified payroll records. Is that right?
Well, they would, they'd have to show
how do they
their payroll, and I guess if they're starting July 1st, they negotiated a 2% wage increase, the county, I'm sure, would then, under this provision, have to take that into consideration. Their wages are going up 2%, and that's going to cost, increase their costs, which their costs are not just labor. And would get them an increase in the contract price of whatever percent would be enough to cover the 2%. I mean, that would require some accounting and figuring out, procurement would have to approve it, and, but, yeah.
Is the director of procurement compelled to do that by any of this language? And do they have the resources to do that? Are they going to come back in a few years and say, well, the costs weren't passed on because we didn't have an accountant we needed or some other resource?
Well, I mean, one, we certainly could put in a provision like you suggested, the authorizing the director of procurement. I think the director of procurement would have the authority without that provision to go in and audit, because they have a provision in every contract that allows them to audit the contractor's costs.
Yeah.
I mean, they already have that authority. I mean, they could do that, whether they do it or not.
But in the past, the wages increases haven't been passed on to workers.
But in the
so-
past, it's been simply, show me your increase in costs, here are my increase in costs, okay. It's not show me your increase in costs due to your collective bargaining agreement or whatever you've provided to employees as a wage increase. I think that's the difference here, is it really is tied to the wage increase. And so they're going to have to prove that they really are increasing the wages. The procurement would be free to, and probably wise, to look at their costs after the fact to make sure the employees actually got the wage increase. I think they have that authority to do that
But
now.
to that point, what happens if if procurement figures out that they didn't give it to the employee? What is the recourse for the county at that point?
Violation.
At that, we currently audit randomly, and especially if we believe that there are, if we have reports that people are not receiving the living wage, then we audit specifically on all service contracts. And the remedy is that if we find that people have not been paid appropriately, we compel the vendor to pay them, and we compel proof that those payments have been made. Proof in the form of the canceled checks that, the workers have cash. You have to send us, copies of that. So we currently enforce it, and I should probably mention that when we do audits and we find that kind of egregious behavior, I mean, sometimes you'll find that there was, within the week after the living wage increase, they just didn't get it right. Okay, I mean, so those things are sort of like, oops, right? The following week, they got it, they realized and they paid, but we have, when we first started doing these audits, we have found people who were consistently underpaying, and we have compelled them to pay for our audits. One of them, more than a few of them actually, their contracts were not renewed. But I guess the thing that should be mentioned is that a very limited audit budget, and because I compel someone to pay for the audit when I find that sort of egregious behavior, that sort of makes it that makes me able to then do other audits, right? Every bite you take out of, the audit budget, I can put part of that back. I'm not, if I have to audit these vendors, the same set of vendors every year, then the audit budget is going to be a little thin for everybody else. And I don't want everybody else to believe that, okay, now it's open season, because, they cannot come look at me. That's I'm sure it would be an unintended consequence, that, would actually burden other sets of workers who are also doing, difficult work like cleaning our county buildings and things like that. I mean, also people who are in the kinds of jobs that are, capable of that kind of wage exploitation.
But I think that if we were to obviously adopt this bill, this is part of the fiscal impact, and it will be part of what the next executive is going to have to take into consideration. I mean, every year we, on the council, especially GO, will ask, during budget, what capacity do you have? Do you have any issues, et cetera? And so I think through that process, we would have to definitely be mindful of impact in terms of audit, budget, and capacity for procurement to ensure that we're enforcing what we're proposing.
Did you finish, because I interrupted you?
Councilmember.
I'm fine, thank you.
The only other thing, I'd like to make it clear that this should not preclude other expenses, that this should, there was a concern that if you did this, that they could preclude, that you couldn't say that you could get an increase because of fuel or whatever. It's imperative that these businesses stay in business because they're doing their work. So we should not say, if you do this, we're not going to pay you for the rest of it. There's got to be a way to write that in that says that this provision is for this, but it does not preclude the other things and the other provisions.
I could add a sentence to
Yeah.
do that. I mean, that'd be fine. I'm not sure it's necessary, but it isn't a bad idea. It's probably a good idea to say that. A lot of these questions and how do we handle this and can and should be really handled through the writing of the
Regulation.
original contract.
Right.
I mean, it should be contractual provisions. This certainly doesn't preclude them from providing a wage increase for fuel increase or something like that. But there's no harm in adding a sentence like that. I'd be happy to do that.
I'd like to go back to this question about the living wage versus the potential for the general wage. Do contractors have the ability to request an increase, like a sort of an annual increase in their contract because of the living wage? Is that something that they can do if they would like to seek that?
Yes.
And do they do that?
I don't know if that's what this 1.4% average increase actually represents, because I would have to, tell you specifically. It's the CPI. It's the CPI.
Is it the wage CPI, or is it just the CPI of the contract overall?
It's the CPI that Department of Labor publishes, that's the gauge that we use.
Department of Labor publishes for inflation or for the?
Yes, and we do it specifically to the refuse industry, which is actually a little bit higher than the general.
So they come in typically and they request a CPI-based increase annually. Would they continue to, somehow these two things have to be factored together. So we need some language that, you can't double dip here. You can't get a CPI increase in your whole contract and a GWA-based bump So how do you deduct one from the other, you know?
If I may, I think what you're saying is that right now, they can come in with a request to increase based on wages, fuel, other things. So you're saying that would be double dipping if they could do that through the CPI as well as this additional language.
Well, I don't know. I guess I'm kind of asking the question, you know? I'm asking the question, and minimally, I would say, is there language that says, oh, because we don't require them to request an increase or allow them to, they can request an increase based
I'm
on
mandatory to provide it to them.
the increase of the living wage requirement if they want to. They could specify that, but they don't. You're saying they don't typically specify that. They just request a inflationary increase.
Or whatever the expenses were that they incurred in the prior year, including wages.
That all has to be documented
Yeah.
in their request for the increase.
Right. And that has to be documented, so they have to show that 1 point. Okay, well then that's sort of how you get to the answer, right, is,
And they can do that every year.
right, but, okay, and you don't have to give them that 1 point, you don't have to give them an inflationary increase if you don't want to, so you can look at their request and say, well, they've asked for 1.6% plus 2%. So, you know, they're asking for 2.2%, and we're not, that's, you know, we don't agree with that.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but our practice has been, what they submit has to be audited by a CPA, so we generally don't question it, we approve it, because it's a statement of their expenses and it's been audited by an independent third party.
Okay, but in the future, you would need to have a more refined approach,
To make
because
sure that there
if
isn't.
if they separately request, well, I don't know how they're gonna request, we just don't know how they're gonna request. There's an issue here. I'm not,
It's the same way.
you guys have a thought on it?
Councilmember,
They're going to have to make a request based on their wage increase and a separate request based on everything else, anything else that went up. And, you know, this contract would require us to provide an increase in contract price to cover the wage increase. The other increases would be
Optional.
discretionary with procurement. You know, so they're just going to have to be a little more detailed about where their increases come from.
Right.
And I don't, you know, I would think that's doable.
yeah, I mean, I think isn't that through like what the contract requires and what the, you know, contractor has to provide, like you do with any
I mean,
contract
you know, they're going to
with the
say,
government.
my fuel expenses, fuel prices went up, this is my cost for fuel. My wages went up, this is my cost for wages. My insurance went up, this is my cost for insurance. And we'll have to provide whatever, we'll have to cover the wages, the rest would be negotiable.
Yeah. Councilmember Hucker.
Well, I mean, to answer Hans's question, they would, where at the level contractors, trash hauling contractors pay now, they would qualify for both the CPI increase under the living wage requirement and any additional wage increase they're passing on through Bob's amendment. But that's,
You think they're additive?
I do.
I don't think so.
Why would it not be?
Because we assume that the CPI adjustment they're getting in their contract is partially for their living wage mandatory increase.
Sure, I was going to say, the only reason they were talking about this at all is because they voluntarily choose to pay their workers. I mean, we have 666 service contracts, right? The living wage only sets the floor for those and says, we, as a value of the county, we're not going to pay any people less than that. So if there were a trash hauler that voluntarily decided to pay their workers $17 an hour, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all, right?
Then there would just be, right, I mean, there wouldn't be an increase due to the,
1550 or
to
anything,
the
right?
CPI due to the, you know, the living wage increase, right?
Right.
That wouldn't necessarily
That's-
affect them, it would be, you know, they would have, but they would be able to show that their wages went up by this amount and that increased their costs. It has nothing to do with.
That's my point, is we're only talking about the scenario in which the trash hauler is paying only the living wage and qualifying for the
Yeah, I would assume that the thresholds are not paying all their employees at the living wage.
Right.
Because
Well, not
their
the
employees are
drivers, for
doing
sure.
different jobs, and some of them are valued higher than others. But even if they were, and they could negotiate a larger increase than the CPI under this provision, and we would just take that increase. It doesn't really matter what component of the increase in wages is due to the CPI adjustment to the living wage law or the collective, it's
Right.
just a total wage increase.
Right.
We don't really care where it came from.
Right, and it's a small number of workers, it's only the helpers that are,
It's only the people at the very bottom. Well, I mean, I guess the people at the bottom get a CPI increase, they're gonna have to increase the people above them too. Otherwise, they have wage compression.
and that only happens annually.
But, right, and this would happen annually too. But I mean, I don't really see the living wage increase, CPI increase, having a significant effect on how this provision works, because this provision would be based on whatever they actually are paying. They have to pay at least the living wage, but whatever they are paying, that's what they would get an increased cost, up to an increase up to the general wage
That's my point,
adjustment.
is
with
as
a
long as they're
limit.
at 1480, we're not even, there's nothing to talk about.
Yeah, I don't see that as a really kink in this, actually.
You need to touch your.
The CPI itself does include the cost of wages. So if we are excluding that from consideration because we're putting it as a different provision in the contract, then we're actually giving them an additional allowance for expenses that we're paying them elsewhere.
That's double dipping.
So that's double dipping. I just wanted to
I think you're going to have to
mention that.
come up with a revised basis for your annual increase. And it may not be as simple as just the CPI.
Yeah, we use that because it's industry-wide, and,
Right.
and everyone, including the contractors, consider it to be fair and
And
equitable.
it might be that, exactly, you might have to have a CPI plus, and they have to document what was essentially the delta between that component that was already for wages and what they've asked for.
So if the increase was solely due to wages, then we could consider that. Is that what you're suggesting? Use the CPI, but if you demonstrate that your additional cost for fuel, whatever, has gone beyond the CPI, if it's just strictly to wages, that we would
That's what I'm
consider
saying,
it
is you
some
get to
other
build
way.
your own CPI.
Yeah, they're not going to be able to use the CPI.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to use the CPI. You were previously making an assumption that by awarding a CPI-based increase, that some share of that was going to go to the wage increases that presumably were being granted. And now you're going to have to construct a different justification, so they'll submit labor, fuel, other things. And it might be a little more than the CPI increase.
Yeah, I don't think that's up to council members to, provide specific micro design for how a particular department is going to implement a law that the council passes.
I just think it's important that
the
the
way-
intent is not to be
No, I
CPI
think-
plus wage.
I mean, I think
The
we've,
intent
I think
is-
Drummer has explained exactly what the intent is, and then for some reason that's not clear, maybe we can have a conversation afterwards, but I just get a little bit concerned when, you're asking Council President how to specifically design this. I mean, that's not something that we should be doing. That's something that, once we understand what the intent is, then the departments are able to modify and add processes that implement the fidelity of the particular law. So, Mr. Drummer, do you think that there's still some confusion here? Or, I mean, I thought it was,
I
described it pretty,
Yeah, I think it's, this is, the mandatory provision just deals with an increase in wages. That's all. The contract can provide for something else.
Right.
And I think adding a sentence that Councilmember Katz suggested just to make it clear, it doesn't preclude a contract provision that provides an increase in cost due to other reasons other than labor costs or wage increases. That's fine, because I think that's the way it should be interpreted anyway. I don't see a problem with this language from what I'm hearing as far as implementation. I think it's going to be a little more difficult for them to implement. If they've been simply using the CPI to provide an adjustment to contractors who come in and say, my cost went up, and okay, we'll give you the CPI increase. There's a new world. That's not going to be, it's going to fly anymore. They're going to have to actually demonstrate how increases in their costs have changed since the last year when they bid the contract. They're going to have to show how they calculated their costs, what's changed, and how much it's changed. It's going to be a little more complicated procedure. I don't see why it isn't doable, but again, I'm not the person that's going to be doing it. It's easy to say that now. But they're just going to have to do it differently. And, that's what I see here. I will say I neglected to mention that we did get an email I saw, I think, over the weekend, that Leuna is okay with the language that I drafted.
Yeah, I did mention that at the beginning of the session.
Okay. I mean, 'cause there's a message from them in the packet, which was earlier. There was a second one came out over the weekend, just so that you all have that. It's not in the packet because I didn't get it before
If I
that.
may, I'd just like to echo what you're saying. I think it will be a little more complicated because we rely on an industry standard now. We won't necessarily be able to do that. And as I mentioned, we generally don't, we have never questioned what they've submitted. But now we'll have to be doing the analysis to basically ensure that, and the back and forth, which will increase costs for us and them.
Right. Okay, all right, so we do have then a proposal here on page 9 and page 10. I know, Mr. Drummer, you're going to work on the language that Councilmember Katz had suggested to clarify something further, and then you can, share that with us. But what I'd like to do is just to get a sense of support or opposition to this language that was developed, plus, of course, we'll see the amendment. So,
Support
Is it-
we discussed, the staff amendment was.
okay, great. So that's a consensus vote on that one. All right, and then we have one more particular,
The last issue is, the third part is the Displaced Service Workers Act, adding the trash hauling contracts to that. And the committee asked me to draft language that would add them to the Displaced Service Workers Act, but only require a successor contract to offer employment to the affected service employees during that initial 90-day transition period, only to the extent the successor contract needs to hire new employees to perform work on the contract. I believe that was a response to my point that if the contractor actually has employees and they're moving from one section to another, if you require them to hire all the other employees, then they're firing all their current
Yeah.
employees, which is probably not our goal, I would think. So I did draft that language, and it's on page 12 of the packet. And once again, I'm not recommending you add trash hauling to the Displaced Service Workers Act, but if you're going to do it, I think this embodies the request from the committee to limit it to just if you need to hire new employees. And again, the email I got over the weekend, Leona supported this language.
any questions? Councilmember Elridge?
Only because of our experience with legislating stuff and people finding workarounds that are aggravating. What's to stop somebody from saying, have a division that picks up trash in Prince George's County, moving all those employees over to take the contract in Montgomery County and then hiring all new employees to do the contract in Prince George's County, which kind of defeats the spirit of what we're trying to do, because they would be able to say, I'm using my existing employees, but in fact using their existing employees, but then hiring all new employees for the other contract they had. I mean, I only ask this because these companies, as a rule, don't carry surplus employees around. They hire up for the contracts they have. So you can pretty much guarantee that none of them have 30 employees sitting around not working and collecting paychecks. And they hire up when they get a new contract, and they let go when they lose a contract. So I'd hate to find somebody circumventing, and maybe we can, see whether that actually happens. But I'm just, aware that if somebody wanted to, they could do that pretty easily, and that wouldn't be what we intended.
The practice in reality, not in theory, is that they typically do hire the employees that have been working in that area. It's to their benefit to do so.
You would
The
think so.
drivers know the routes, the helpers know the routes. Why would they bring in a group of employees from Prince George County that have never been to Montgomery County? So even though it's not legislated in the contract, that typically is exactly what happens.
And, I should add, the reason is to their benefit is because we actually do have liquidated damage provisions that, if they're late, if they miss pickups, et cetera, those add up. That becomes more costly. And so you really want to keep the people who already know what the drill is.
I'm not proposing any legislation. I just think we need to monitor, make sure that, and I'm not asking you to actively monitor, but I'm sure we'll hear, and I just want to be sure that we're as we plan.
Okay, any
Well, it's done.
objection from the committee members for this language, to add this to the displaced worker bill? Councilor
might-
Hucker, before.
Did we, I, grateful for everything the committee's done, do we lose sight of the enforcement thing at all? How do we avoid the problems of the past and compel a future DP director, procurement director to do the audit? I'm less concerned about the contracts that, say, LiUNA represents now. That could change in the future. But right now, we have 2 non-union trash haulers, at least 2, I think, maybe 3, that won't be audited by anybody unless we have some mechanism to audit, to enforce any wage increases.
They are.
No, we audit them. The fact that they're union or not has nothing to do with whether or not we audit them.
Oh.
They
it's the
have
reimbursement issue. It's the
authority and
reimbursement issue. Okay, we
provision
didn't cover
of
this. Okay.
auditing. I mean, it just, all these things really can and should be and are generally covered in the contract.
It's the structure of the
It's a
increase.
matter of
Sorry.
whether they have any money
Apologize,
to
we
do
covered
it.
that.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation, especially as we get into budget time and with the transition of a new administration, to just also follow up on, because it's a good point. I mean, the capacity the departments have to obviously enforce a lot of these well-intentioned pieces of legislation, it's a constant
For sure.
struggle.
But it's
So-
also the structure of Bob's amendment, because
Yeah.
they're putting out the money and then they're getting reimbursed by the county. So, good, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, so just want to make sure that it was a 3-0 on the second amendment. Anything else, Mr. Walker,
Yeah,
that's
there's some
outstanding?
technical amendments starting on page 13, that we didn't go over last time, that came from the county attorney's office, that I don't think actually, I think just make it a little clearer in the bottom of page 13, that I would request you approve.
Okay, any comments on that or questions? All right, without objection, we approve those technical amendments.
So then the bill, I gather, is being reported favorably, 3-0 with the amendments.
Okay,
And I can send you by email language. I can tell you basically the language I would add to that provision on the price increase would just be, this provision does not preclude or prohibit, does not prohibit a contractual provision that would permit an increase in contract price due to costs other than wage increases.
that sounds good. Okay.
Just to be clear on our homework, the council president had a question about the percentage of people covered. Do you still want that information from us?
anymore,
Okay.
frankly. I think we
Thank
kind of
you.
got to that same issue.
Okay, thank you.